hundreds of billions of dollars lost and trillions of dollars of market cap that will be wiped out. You will see the megas go public. You will see the minnows go extinct.
Josh Wolfe has been predicting the future of venture capital for 25 years, and he has a track record of being right. His firm, Lux Capital, recently closed a $1.5 billion fund and now manages more than $7 billion in assets. But Wolfe says venture is heading for a reckoning, one that could wipe out thousands of firms.
3,000 plus firms that exist today. I think there's going to be a 50% extinction rate. And this LP, who's a large and sophisticated investor, said, Josh, that is ridiculous. It's going to be 90%.
As capital floods the space, everyone wants into venture right now, and Wolfe says that's exactly the problem.
What the wise do in the beginning, the fools do in the end.
So, what's Josh's playbook for success, and how exactly does he spot a winning startup? Welcome to Term Sheet. I'm Allie Garfinkle. Now on to this week's news. If you watch this show, you know we are in hot IPO summer. SpaceX has gone public in the largest IPO in history. Stock popped 20% the first day, but now the watch is on for both OpenAI and Anthropic. When they go public, who goes first, and how it happens will be the defining events of the private markets this summer. Now, one thing to consider, I was talking to an Anthropic investor recently who pointed out to me that it is actually really important who goes out first between these two companies, because the company that goes out first is going to get to tell its story to America about why it is the company for retail investors, the company for the future, and the one to trust. And definitionally, who goes second will be the point of comparison, not the trend setter. So keep an eye out for not only who is filing, but who is filing first. And if you're really interested in this, we are covering hot IPO summer a lot in our term sheet newsletter, so please sign up. So who do you think will file first, OpenAI or Anthropic? Let me know in the comments. And now, on to my interview with Josh. Josh Wolfe, welcome to Term Sheet.
Good to be with you.
I am excited to have you here because you've been very vocal about a lot of the changes in venture. Recently, Lux raised $1.5 billion. And you've also said that you're expecting to sort of see the extinction of a lot of small firms. Where is the balance of power in venture capital right now?
My view is we're witnessing, and this started as a speculation maybe 2 years ago, but now it's an observation that it's happening, a bifurcation between what I call the minnows and the megas. And I think about this sort of as a giant ocean. The minnows are the small fish, and the small fish are basically sub-scale. You can say that sub-100, sub-300, sub-500. That's sort of where I would cut the line, but a $500 million fund or smaller. And when we first started in the business, I want to say 25 years ago, there were probably 1,000 firms. It ballooned up to 2,000 and then collapsed after the dot-com crisis. That took 2 or 3 years to sort of play out, down to about 800 firms. So you had net new entrants, but then massive extinction. I made the prediction 2 years ago that the 3,000 plus firms that exist today that have ballooned from about 1,500 a few years ago, mostly driven by solo GPs, meaning a solo VC that is just one person raised a $50, $100, $150 million fund, or small funds that were specialists in niches, were going to go extinct. Why would they go extinct? Inadequate reserves to continue investing in some of the large companies, failure of succession planning in some of their junior partners, or that they were just in the wrong sector and they were too narrowly focused and didn't have the range. And I was with one of my large LPs and I said that, I think there's going to be a 50% extinction rate. And this LP, who's a large and sophisticated investor, said, Josh, that is ridiculous. It's going to be 90%. And so you are already starting to see the number of first-time funds or second-time funds, their ability to raise capital is getting harder and harder. And so new funds are declining, existing funds that are under-reserved or were in the wrong sector, many people that were exposed to SaaS for 10 years. It's very hard to make a pivot into aerospace and defense or into AI, maybe is a little bit closer, biotech and other things are harder, but many of those firms are just going to go extinct. Now, for us, situated sort of in this middle as what I'm going to describe, we lose some of the early stage funds that were providing us deal flow, and we would never bite the hand that feeds us. And there are some great people there. Many of them are going to be absorbed into existing platforms. Some made a lot of money and will call in rich. And others will just say, this is really hard and either go and start companies or just check out. So that's the minnows. The megas are the large funds that are now approaching 80 to 100 billion AUM, assets under management. And there's a handful of firms, all of whom I respect, and they're playing an important part of the ecosystem, and they have built extraordinary franchises. But I would say 3 in particular, probably Andreessen Horowitz, General Catalyst, and General Atlantic, are all gearing up to go public. And they are following the playbook of 2009 when you had the private equity firms that sort of in alphabetical order, roughly, Apollo, Blackstone, Carlyle, KKR, TPG, all went public. It was post-crisis. They were diversified alternative asset management platforms, but mostly focused on private equity. The same thing will happen in the growth equity and alt asset, but for venture. And you will see the megas go public. You will see the minnows go extinct. And there will probably be 10 firms in this messy middle that are able to do everything from a $100,000 or $1 million check that can be a fund maker on a $1.5 billion size fund to a $150 million high conviction check. And yeah, I'd say there's like 10 firms that are going to be the dominant force there.
So do you consider yourself a minnow, a mega? It sounds like something in the middle.
Yeah, I think we're in the middle. And,
Which is a tough spot to be in some
No,
level.
I think it's great because you're able to do early stage investments. You're able to do late stage investments. You're able to benefit from the dearth of competition because we were competing with anybody that could write a check. And you're able to benefit from the provision of late stage capital at higher prices or lower cost of equity from some of these folks that aren't. Some would critically or pejoratively call them index funds. I don't think they are, but they're doing more and more deals across the board at higher prices, and they're playing an important part of the ecosystem. I would say us, Founders Fund, Thrive, Sequoia, Amplify, Addition, a handful of others are able, Khosla Ventures, are able to do a few $1 million check in a seed or do a de novo company because we love to create companies from scratch as well, and can write a large high conviction check later on.
One of the things that's been true for me over the last few months is I've been having a little bit of a crisis of faith around venture. A lot of things started sounding the same to me. But part of the reason I was so excited to have you is because I can actually articulate what you do because you guys have. Turning science fiction into science fact sounds a little crazy, but is distinctly memorable. What is the most outrageous company you've ever backed? What do you consider to be the craziest?
Robotic surgery. This literally was inspired out of Star Wars when Luke Skywalker gets his hand cut off by Darth Vader. And you literally see a robotic surgeon, repairing it. We keep an archive of old sci-fi footage, and we marry it with some of the companies that we've been backing. And this is a company that we were founding investors in called Aura Surgical Robotics, but born out of sci-fi and Star Wars. Another one was born out of X-Men. We read a lot of scientific journals, and I read Science and Nature and Proceedings of the National Academies of Science, and we're deep with academic PhDs and Nobel Prize winners, and we watch a lot of sci-fi and read a lot of graphic novels, and sometimes the inspiration comes from that. There was a moment when, 6 years ago, I'm watching X-Men. I just get this inspiration. I said, X-Men is ridiculous. It's science fiction. And you have Professor X who puts on Cerebro and can spot a mutant in a crowd, and he's able to see people who are conjuring fire from their fingers and turning invisible and floating, and all of that is nonsense, but it's cool. But if you think about the real world, we have 8 billion people, and if there's a 1 in a billion chance of some rare genotype that leads to a phenotype, a trait, that lets you, for example, hold your breath at high altitudes like in the Himalayas, or plunge to the depths of the ocean and hold your breath, or eat fatty foods and not gain weight, or drink alcohol and not gain liver disease, or smoke cigarettes like somebody like Jim Simons and not get cancer and live to your 90s. That's an interesting protective variant. And so I started talking to people about this, and I usually, again, get these 2 opposing ideas or comments. One is stupidest idea I've ever heard in my life, or oh my God, it's all I've ever wanted to work on. And I found these 2 PhDs out of Cold Spring Harbor and put them together in a company called Variant Bio. And the mission was find outlier people in outlier parts of the world with outlier traits and bring their genetics and their phenotypes back to the millions of masses. And it turns out that most of these populations are in really weird parts of the world with consanguineous. That's a nice way
I
of...
would say, how weird? What are we talking about here?
Well, for example, and this is a very practical one, there's a tribe in Africa that has total water scarcity, but they don't get kidney disease. And that's really interesting. And so for people that are suffering from kidney disease in the United States, what is it about their protective variant in their environmental circumstance that they evolved over generations that can be basically turned into a drug and given to the masses? There's another set of families in South America that have a heat shock protein because of the precipitous temperature drop at night. And this was a very interesting one where they basically raise their body temperature more than normal than the average person at night. Well, now you're increasing the metabolic activity while you're sleeping. So could you turn that into a pill so that people could burn fat while they sleep? And so those kinds of things are really out there. It is sci-fi born into sci-fact. This particular company, Variant Bio, now run by this guy, Andrew Farnham, who ran the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Investment Program. They have 4 hits going into the clinic of drugs. And it started as a crazy brain fart of an idea out of sci-fi from watching X-Men.
Well, it gets to an interesting question, too, that I've wanted to ask you, I think, for some time, which is how do you distinguish between what is scientifically possible and what is just hype?
It's really sophisticated, hard you need a PhD, and it comes down to 3 words: does it work? And it's amazing how few people basically check, does it work? Now, if you're looking at something that is a hypothesis and you want to test it, then it's almost like a poker game. And you want to ask how much capital accomplishes what in what period of time and who will care. And so we ante up, mostly because we like to say that we believe before others understand. And so we will believe in a founder, and we will check the science, and we will talk to our network, which is ever growing, and we will say, do you think this is real, and why might it work or might not? And what are the experiments that you have to do to prove that it will? And somebody will say, well, it'll probably take 6 months and $4 million. And we say, okay, everything times pi. So it's not going to take 4 million, it's going to take over 12 million. It's not going to take 6 months, it's going to take 18. But let's fund that, because at the other end of that, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, nobody else will have done this. It'll be scarce, it'll have a moat on it, and it'll become valuable. And I'm obsessed with understanding, to your point, when you said you've become disenamored with talking to like venture folks and people that just say the same cliched stuff. I get very bored with founders who come in and say, I just want to change the world, or they're pitching the same thing. I like people that are obsessive about a particular thing. They have a chip on their shoulder, and they're driven, and they're working in a space that no matter how much money somebody else had, they wouldn't be able to compete with them. And I am obsessed with the competitive advantage that the obsessive chip on the shoulder entrepreneur has in a technical domain that other people can't get into.
Well, and to your point, I have a thing I've started saying, which is that the great American capital machine has maybe just gotten too big for its own good, which is why you're seeing so many copycats of so many different businesses. And I have a crazy notebook where I write down all sorts of things that are like, too many drone startups, ? Too many healthcare admin AI startups, period.
Right.
One of them is the death of venture ? And I don't think venture is just about having a small fund or a large fund, but I do think it is about backing things that seem impossible or could be impossible without somebody who believed in them and had the money to put towards it. Is the death of venture, was that where we're headed? I don't know. Am I being dramatic?
No, I don't see that. I think that venture generally has cycles, right? In the cycles, you've had these biologistic S curves, total nascency, rapid growth, maturity in every sector that you can imagine. In the 70s, it was personal computers. In the 80s, it was biotech. In the 90s, it was TMT and .com and fiber optics. Then you had SaaS, and then mobile, and now it's AI. So there will always be, and this is a feature, not a bug, a over allocation of capital that follows hype and excitement and FOMO. That FOMO turns into, fear of missing out, turns into what I call sobs, the shame of being suckered. At some point, you feel really dumb, and you're like, oh my God, I don't want to do that.
I haven't heard that one before.
But the virtue of this is, a priori, you don't know what companies are going to work. If somebody would have said in the late 90s, you know what, we have too many search engines. Like, this is enough already. Look Smart and Alta Vista and Yahoo, and then all of a sudden Google comes along. But the people that funded Google not only helped change the benefit of society for searching through these needles in a haystack, but made fortunes, for everybody that was involved. So I think that it's a feature that we get a abundance of companies, lots of experiments tried. 99% of them are going to fail, and the 1% that survive go on to make fortunes and change industries. So that will persist forever. It's one of the great things about capital markets. It's why the United States has the wealth that it does compared to Europe. Embracing failure. And nobody wants to be on the side of failure, but it's an inevitable feature, not a bug of the system.
I was going to say, so basically what you're saying is my exasperation is in response to something that is ultimately a feature and not a bug, and the cycle will evolve.
The cycle will crash. You pick your sector that you're like, oh my God, I'm so sick of hearing about the 12th drone company or the 12th, 200,000th AI company.
Only 200,000?
Yeah, 99% of them will fail. But the 1% that survive, and you're already seeing that, by the way, the concentration of capital in what people are deeming the winners, particularly in AI, is very large. So it's a feature, not a bug.
I was going to say, where do you think the AI bubble goes? What does it look like on the other side of this? Because it sounds like you're like, yes, of course it's a bubble. It's going to pop. That's the way it works.
Yes. You've got your handful of major labs, number one, and I think that they are reaching sort of peak utility to the average consumer, meaning the incremental spend that they will have to make ChatGPT 5 or 6 or Sonus 4.7 or Opus 4.5.1, it's marginal. There are new sectors that you can go into, particularly in scientific productivity, things in aerospace and defense, which have a lot of controversy around them, which are giant markets. So I think the push of AI into industrial is going to be a big thing. The bigger contrarian take is that I believe there are going to be enormous hundreds of billions of dollars lost and trillions of dollars of market cap that will be wiped out. because the presumption that we need endless demand of data centers and hundreds of thousands of H100 chips, the NVIDIA chips inside of each of these, and the high bandwidth memory that's attached to that, and the power that is needed for that, including the speculative sources of power, I believe that that is wrongheaded. And what the wise do in the beginning, the fools do in the end, and what one company does rationally collectively becomes irrational, and that's what happens when you have a bubble. What comes next is, I believe, and we've backed a company in this that will come out of stealth too. So I'm talking in my book here, but it is a bias rooted in a directional arrow of progress. And it's actually a founder that we backed in the past. And his insight was, we can't compete to make the next LLM that is going to do next word prediction or Bayesian inference or summarization or conjuring your poem or your artist or your video or your image. But let's look at something else, which has a very low power envelope. Let's look at a fruit fly. A fruit fly is ridiculous. This little thing can navigate this room, can evade us as a predator or as a threat in trying to kill it, can find a mate, can find a food source, has local memory to go back to that, and it does it on microwatts of power with a brain and a cortical structure that is the size of the tip of a pencil. So instead of going larger and larger in scaling laws and more compute and more power, why don't we go the other direction and not do this for next word prediction, but for the future of embodied intelligence in drones and robots and whatever new devices are going to come that can navigate the real world. They are able to detect shadows and quickly evade. They don't put a prompt in and wait 4 seconds for it. It's instantaneous. And so if you look at the design of the cortical structure of all kinds of animals through evolution, from an insect, from a fruit fly to a mouse, to a dog, to a cat, to a human, there's 20 watts of power. And this thing doesn't flex up on top of my head when it has to be pre-trained or post-trained. It's just 20 watts of constant power. And we are the ultimate one-shot learners. So I think there's going to be a big push into computational neuroscientists that are reverse engineering the cortical structure of the brain to come up with more efficient chips and algorithms for the next wave of AI, and it's going to blow people's minds.
I was going to say, that actually doesn't sound crazy to me at all, especially because fruit flies, the byproduct of the research result of many Nobel Prizes, right, also share a lot of genetic material with humans.
Yes.
And I think I don't think it's an accident that someone like Demis Hassabis, for example, has a PhD in neuroscience.
So does Dario, and so does Reardon, who we backed in the prior company. And
who is known only as Reardon.
Only as Reardon, and is the founder of this new company that'll come out soon. Yes.
Tell him to call me.
Yes, I will.
Tell him to call me. Reardon, if you're listening, call me.
He will. But that is to me the directional arrow. There's another big trend that I think is really interesting that I've dubbed life courting. And this is one of those directional arrows of progress. Again, it also has an age and demographic discomfort and comfort with it. Life courting is what I've dubbed for all of the devices that are going to come. At first, it started as a speculation, but again, it's an observation now.
CORDING?
Yeah, like recording your life. So it's a neologism of life courting. It is the thing like the pendant from Limitless. That was a small device. It basically was a magnetic clip. Half of it was a magnet and the battery. Half of it was a microphone. So that got me interested. Okay, what is this thing doing? You're able to passively record your entire day. It's got enough power that it can last passively for 12 hours and can record everything throughout your day. My general counsel and most older people are really discomforted by this idea. Young people who are sort of digitally always on, it presents really interesting moral questions of how you behave and whether this information will be revealed and that kind of stuff. Amazon then bought a company called The Bee, which was a wrist-borne device that did effectively the same thing. There are about 4 other companies that have started. And then you have the big labs. So Johnny Ive at I/O, which is OpenAI's hardware element division, they are most likely going to have a always-on set of recording devices that can integrate with OpenAI and ChatGPT to tell insights about your day. Who did you see? What did you talk about? Who mentioned that book? Or what meeting was I in when people said that? People are already comfortable with the laptop-based or phone-based Otter or Granola for recording and transcribing and summarizing meetings. There will be this trade-off between privacy and productivity, which is a perennial trade-off in technology, whether you give yourself over to the information gods, whether that stuff can be used for discoverability and litigation. It will have complex set of considerations like all technology does as it evolves, but this is an inevitability. Where does that lead me? The computational components that go into these devices, as you have hundreds of companies that are going to be producing and competing them. And again, 99% of them will fail. But who will be the beneficiaries? The people that are making MEMS microphones, digital signal processors, novel capacitors, and new batteries. It's a new segment of technology where one or more of these companies, some of them publicly traded, will get a demand shock because Meta will say, we need 50,000 or we need 100,000. They'll say, like, oh my God, we can't make that. And they're going to get pricing power. Somebody's going to do a teardown of one of these devices, post it online. Stocks are going to rocket. It's going to become a new phase. So I'm calling it life courting. I'm of high conviction, and Lux has been making investments in the technological and scientific roots of this for this next phase.
I want to pivot to defense because you were an early backer of Anduril in 2017. What was that conversation like? Because I understand you got a lot of pushback at the time.
Well, the conversation, it started, and again, I want to be intellectually honest, did not start with an analysis or a DCF or some consultant report about, this hockey stick growth in defense. It started with a brunch. Actually, we debate whether it was brunch or breakfast, but it definitively was at Balthazar, and it was me and Trey Stevens, an amazing friend and a partner at Founders Fund, and he said, I'm going to be starting this company with Palmer Luckey, and it's going to be a more kinetic, hardware-driven style of defense instead of Palantir, and I said, on the spot, I'm in. We're in. And so we became founding investors. And it was controversial because at the time, Trump was talking about let's build the wall. One of the first products that they wanted to do was take a whole suite of technologies and put them into a form factor that was basically a virtual wall that would give border protection with these Sentry towers, which were actually using...
It became Sentry.
Correct. And it was using technologies from one of the other companies that we had backed that was doing radar, using this crazy technology that itself was out of sci-fi called Metamaterials, a company that we had started with Bill Gates and Intellectual Ventures. And they were integrating that into the device. It was the first company that we had to contend with the moral question, are you comfortable funding something that will be involved in a kill chain? We had been investors for over 15 years in all kinds of intelligence community facing things, defense things that were dual use, but never something that said, are you comfortable being involved in a kill chain? We had two partners that were opposed to this. We ended up having to off-ramp these partners. It was sort of a tragic thing, but morally we had this debate internally, and I felt very strongly, the greater your technological precision in any kind of military affairs, the greater your moral precision. If you have the ability to discriminate between a guy that is coming home from aerial data or a drone, a guy that is coming home from a mine or a farm with a pickaxe on his shoulder, and a guy that is coming with an AK-47 to shoot up a school of girls, that is a clear moral discrimination that you want to be able to make to, in one case, prevent human suffering, and in both cases, to prevent human suffering, to not make the wrong action and to make the right action. And it's unfortunate that there are bad people in the world, but you do want good people with better technology fighting the bad people with ideally worse technology. And so we became comfortable with the moral question that the good guys should have the best technology. And if we sat back in that debate or argument, then the bad guys would continue funding, the sort of asymmetric threats. And so, we became founding investors in Anduril. And then from there, Saildrone, Hadrian, Varda, Impulse Space, every domain that you can imagine, air, land, sea, space, subsea, and now even subterranean, underground warfare. We have also funded UK, Israel, Bulgaria, Japan. We haven't yet done South Korea or India, but I want to. And then we've also done one in the Middle East, particularly in sync with the United Arab Emirates, which I think are amazing. And very bullish on Western defense in support of Western values, which are both being kinetically and ideologically attacked.
Well, and, for me, it took me a while to get comfortable, to your point, covering defense tech, because I was very comfortable with, say, reading about World War II, but was I comfortable thinking about war and technology that could kill? I've thought about this a lot. And I recently profiled Brian Schimpf, CEO of Anduril.
Amazing leader.
And I actually asked him what I'm going to ask you. How do you explain what some of these companies do to your kids?
Not only do I explain it, I show them videos. And I am so bullish on this next generation that wants to work on some of these hard problems. If you look outside in your lobby here at Fortune, the covers on the magazines as you enter this floor are 1942, 1945, 1951. I mean, extraordinary legacy of Fortune. But the covers are celebrating science and military and technology, because the way that people were able to make fortunes over the ensuing 5 decades or 6 decades since were because we had this arsenal of democracy, because we were celebrating the people that were inventing the technologies to protect this country, our economy, our way of life, our markets. So I feel very strongly that, if anything, this past generation, because we had one war of choice and one war of necessity, you could argue, as Richard Haas might call it, between Iraq, one in Afghanistan, the war on terror. There's a lot of people that rightly have been disenamored, people that were disenamored post World War II and Cold War and Vietnam. But the forces that we are fighting today, even if you look at Iran, these are not good people. We want to see positive change and security in America, and you need cutting edge technologies, and I believe that is on the force of moral good.
Well, and I will say the thing that I really was the deciding factor for me was when I realized that a lot of men and women in uniform were going into conflict zones with technology less advanced than they used when they ordered an Uber. That really blew my mind. And I think it blew a lot of minds of investors, as evidenced by the fact that defense went from something that was deeply controversial that you didn't really do, and now it feels like everybody wants to do it. In my crazy notebook, I have written defense tech bubble ?
Yes.
It is a question asked in sincerity, but do you think there's a bubble?
Not yet, but soon. And I will tell you, by the way, 11th Commander of SOCOM, Tony Thomas, who we ended up bringing onto our team, sent me out to Indo-PACOM for nearly 2 weeks and embedded with Special Operations Forces, 6 different countries. And this was right before COVID. And he said, I want you to come back to the Pentagon and report back to me. And to your exact point, I remember as simple as 5 operators in the Philippines that had the inability to do what they call blue dot tracking, what we're able to pull up our iPhone and basically see where your friends are, find my friends. They could not do that because they were under triple canopy in the jungle. And I had 3 different companies that had technologies that could provide secure environments for them to be able to do that. And I remember coming back and saying, if I was your adversary, I would almost be like the guy with the red stapler in Office Space, that old movie. And I would basically do everything I could to keep your systems exactly as they are and make no change, because that's how I would beat you. And he wanted to punch me in the face. And he later said that. And then he would join Lux. And he's been absolutely amazing. But I do believe that it is unfair that the women and men that are on the front lines do not have the best technology, and they should. Some of that is bureaucracy. Some of that is capture from the Beltway bandits and the large primes. And you are, for the first time, really in 50 years, seeing with Anduril and Palantir and a handful of others and SpaceX soon, the breakthrough with the next generation saying, no, we want the better technologies and better technologists who we trust. So that, I think, is very important. Bubble. I remember being with a very prominent investor who said, you guys were early to defense tech, and you will benefit from a tailwind of capital, but you will also benefit from a phenomenon which I think people don't appreciate that will lead to a bubble. And that is that some of the allocators, just like you as a journalist, were discomforted covering the space, were discomforted investing in the space. So they would say, we won't invest directly in Anduril. Now they all want to, but back then they wouldn't. We're okay investing in Lux because they're a diversified fund, but we wouldn't invest in a defense tech exclusive fund. But we would invest in a fund of funds that invests in a Lux or a defense fund. And so you would get demand for pools of capital that would form that a large endowment or a foundation would give money to, who in turn would give money to, who in turn would give money to. And so that is going to lead to an abundance of capital chasing too few deals. And I do think that even if you look at the Palantir valuation, and Alex Karp is amazing, and Palantir is extraordinary, and the people that work there, Mike Gallagher and Jacob Hellberg, who was there in USA, these are extraordinary people. But the valuation today, to me, represents the pent-up demand that the market has for the next wave of defense, because their alternative is investing in Lockheed or Boeing or Raytheon or L3, and they don't want to do that. So we will see a bubble, but I'm usually wrong in the timing, and I think it'll probably be 2 or 3 years from now.
In late 2021, you said accurately that 2022 will be a punch in the face. Apply that same logic to 2026. What do you think will be true later this year and in 2027?
Well, my crazy speculation, which is not self-serving, is I believe we will see a headline, possibly the end of this year, maybe early next, which is a sad one, but I think a realistic one, which is I think Warren Buffett dies. And I think that the headline says something like, reports of the death of Buffett were not exaggerated, but the reports of the death of value investing were. And what I think happens is we see a 10 or 15% decline in the Nasdaq, very heavily concentrated in the Mag 7 or the Mag 10, whatever you want to call it today. And I think that you see those markets down 10 or 15%. Not crazy market crash, but enough that the concentration of capital, also driven by a structure of a market, largely passive index buying, which has an algorithm in itself, which is dollar in, buy indiscriminately in a market cap weighted index, dollar out, sell indiscriminately. And I think you end up with a handful of value investors, which is not my world, that are up 10 or 15%. And that stark contrast, and I don't know if it's going to be a Dan Loeb or an Einhorn or my wife, Lauren Taylor Wolfe, or some other value investor, but it might be some new person that people suddenly say, oh my God, how are they outperforming by 300 basis points by 30% when the market's down 15 and they're up 15? And I do think that we see a scenario that would be unexpected in that shift from passive growth, which has been dominating for the past 10 plus years, into active value. So that's something that is not self-serving for me as a venture investor, but I feel is a lower probability, high magnitude outcome in market structure that is likely. And the other thing that I think is going to happen is the Strait of Hormuz, which everybody's mostly focused on oil and Iranian control. you could have a scenario that I would put reasonably low odds on, let's call it 10%, which is still maybe high, but huge order of magnitude of salience and importance, where fertilizer scarcity leads to a food crisis on the periphery of Europe, which is unexpected, maybe in a place like Macedonia or Bulgaria or something like that, compounded with migratory pressures, and you get a economic and market and financial crisis in the EU. And you have decline of currency, you have decline of markets, and you have panic. And then I think you get a rise of sort of far-right strongmen that typically are there. That was the most chilling thing in talking to Intel folks recently. As I shared this hypothesis, I always want people to either poo-poo it or sort of validate it or to give me some variant. And they said something that the sort of Hitler or Mussolini or strongman of the 30s and 40s is already in Europe. And they don't know if he's 35 years old or 45 years old or 55 years old, but he's there waiting for the stage. And that's chilling. So that's
your very rosy prediction for the later this year in 2027.
But I will say, against that backdrop of like dark cynicism and preparedness, because I always like to say that failure comes from a failure to imagine failure. So I've imagined a geopolitical and socioeconomic failure, and I've imagined, sort of a bubble in defense, and imagined a crisis in the Nasdaq. Life will always continue to get better because of technology. And while I am very cynical about people, and people are unchanging in their Shakespearean motives, and there's daggers in men's smiles, and we're full of envy and jealousy and all of that kind of stuff, and vaingloriousness, but technology compounds because of science and the scientific pursuit of, and not born because people want to, just discover stuff, but because they're ego-driven and they're competitive, and life keeps getting better. The idea that we have GLP-1s and GPUs and rockets, it's like when you zoom out, it is amazing. And the march of progress will continue despite the daily headlines.
I was going to say, I think your cynicism about people is maybe slightly more complicated, because if you believe people are capable of all of that, you can only be so cynical. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you, Josh.
Great to be with you.
And that was my interview with Josh. I've always found Josh really compelling because he really has a perspective. Whether you agree with it or not, it is interesting. If you're interested in other companies that Josh has backed, we have a feature about Osmo AI, which is Shazam for Scent. That's it for Term Sheet. I'm Allie Garfinkle. We'll see you soon.